right, good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Bingle, and I'm the Director of Grants in the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership at the DeKalb County Community Foundation. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on board culture. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we're going to be recording today's webinar, and that recording will be sent to you later by email along with an evaluation form so that you can provide feedback about this training. We have everyone muted, but please feel free to use the Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom. And we're going to save some time at the end to address questions that you submit. If you're more comfortable, you can send those in a chat directly to me, and I can ask those questions at one shot in the end. Like usual, we'll plan on about 45 minutes or so of content, and then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So with that, we're excited to welcome back Matt Gayer, who's led a number of DCMP webinars for us over the last year, and I'll share a little bit about his background. Matt is a co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy in Washington, D.C., which is the region's only locally focused guide to giving and volunteering. They focus on small nonprofit organizations with the goal of creating visibility for these nonprofits to fuel their growth with philanthropic dollars and to create a movement for social good in the region. Since 2003, the catalog has raised more than $40 million for their network of vetted nonprofits. Before joining the catalog, Matt worked in healthcare consulting at the Advisory Board Company. He's a Truman Scholar, holds a Master of Public Administration degree with a focus on nonprofit management from Syracuse University, and he earned a bachelor's in public policy and political science from Southern Methodist University. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to talk about this topic with y'all. Boards and board culture is so critical, we know. One thing that I think we see common across nonprofit organizations of any size, from grassroots 50K budget up to kind of several $1 million budgets, is that one, that boards matter, and two, that even for organizations with strong boards, there's opportunities to grow them and to make them stronger and more of an asset to the organization. So when we think about board culture today, we'll dive into a few kind of engagement tips with board members, but we'll also talk a lot about some things that might not come first in mind, like recruitment and onboarding. Some of those structural pieces and some early pieces in a board member's life cycle with you are actually really critical to their long-term engagement and the overall culture of the board. Because we'll touch on a lot of things, I know questions may come up. So as Ben mentioned, please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A. We'll save time at the end to touch on those. So before I get into some really kind of specific tips here on a few different areas, I just want to kind of remind folks, right, what's at stake and why do we care about our board in the first place, right? Why is this so important for us to think about the culture and ultimately the engagement of our board of directors? Ultimately, we know the board, right, is kind of co-leading the organization and responsible for the strategy, right, and direction of the organization, making timely decisions, even more so these days. So something to really kind of think about, and know that if boards are really the other side of that leadership coin, we want to make sure we're keeping them engaged and really leveraging them as an asset for the organization. We know a lot of boards have met virtually for a long time. Some have come back in person. Many have come back in person. Some have not. Those in person, maybe sometimes in person, sometimes virtually. And for the last couple of years, we know that board attendance at meetings has actually increased as things have gone virtual. But we've heard time and time again, the engagement, the cohesion, the culture, the interactions between board members has actually kind of decreased over the last couple of years. And then finally, kind of connected to that, it's been harder during these last couple of years of virtual stuff to really get board members connected to the work, to keep them top of mind for knowing kind of why they should care about the work. So it's an important time to engage them, not just in doing things, but reminding them why they're passionate about the work of the organization. So we're going to start with board recruitment, and why we start here and not just kind of diving straight into some board engagement tips is because a lot of the things we'll talk today around board culture and board engagement aren't that different than when you think about your staff culture and staff engagement. right? So what's one of the biggest impacts on kind of your organizational culture and staff engagement? It's who you hire in the first place, right? And it's getting that hiring decision correct. And then it's making sure that person's onboarded correctly and really engaged from the beginning. And then finally, we're thinking about how we actually sustain that, right? And kind of do different things to engage them in their job, do different things to build that culture, to evaluate that culture over time. So we'll definitely talk about that piece towards the end today. But we're going to start here with recruitment, because getting the right board members in the door is one of the most important things we can do for our board culture. I'll also say, as we go through this, a lot of times I'll preempt a question we get a lot of times on this topic, which is that if I don't have the board culture that I want today, right? I've been around for a while, my board already exists, I can't just snap my fingers and start anew. How do I start that journey, right, of changing the board culture at my organization? There's a few different tips and tricks we can give, and I'll highlight those as we're talking later about, meeting agendas and things like that. But one of those is getting new people on who are excited, right? Who want to live into that culture you want for your board. And as you start getting those new members who are kind of being the board you want them to be, other folks will either get in line or self-select out a lot of times. So this recruitment piece becomes really important as a tool for change when it comes to kind of managing the culture of our board. So a couple of tips here on recruitment. We won't spend too long here because we have a lot of things to cover today, but the first and the biggest is just really formalizing the recruitment process. Everything we'll talk about today, even if you're a really small organization, volunteer-led, just one staff person, these are things that don't necessarily take a lot of time, but will really change the dynamic with your board, and hopefully also that culture piece with your board. So when we say kind of formalize the process, we're just saying have the process, really. So a lot of times board recruitment, right, looks pretty informal. I constantly need board members. I'm talking to someone, they mention board service or they seem very invested in what we're doing. We ask them kind of informally, they agree, and then all of a sudden they're on our board, right? For many of us, we may have a more formal process, but I will say that is often the process we hear about. And no worries if that's the process that kind of sounds similar to yours right now, right? It works, and especially when you're first starting out and it's kind of a friends and family board, it makes sense to have that. But as we mature as an organization, as our board matures and hopefully moves forward, we want this to be more and more kind of, there's a structure to it. So the process here we outlined, the first thing is knowing what we want for the board. So setting some goals for the skills we're looking for, the personal demographics, the diversity, the geographic area they're from, the networks that they might have. So we know who we're looking for. So we don't just accept anybody. We actually have some thought process, right? Kind of the same as we would for hiring someone, right? We're looking for a certain type of board member. From there, we're going to do outreach, right? We're going to try to cast a wide net. A lot of times a board member is going to come from someone we already know, right? Or someone who knows a board member or staff person of the organization. But great to make sure we're trying to reach out externally to really see what our options are for who a board member could be. The third piece here, this is probably one of the bigger pieces, and we'll dive more into this here in just a second, is the evaluation interview. So there should be some type of interview process, and what that looks like can vary, and we'll talk more about it here in a minute. But we want to make sure that people are not just asked and then joined, right? We want them to go through some type of process of evaluation, and we'll talk about what that looks like. Then eventually they're selected and hopefully celebrated. We want them to really feel this is an honor and that we're excited about them, but they should also be excited to be on our board, right? Kind of fixing that power dynamic a bit there. And then we want to do some successful onboarding, which we'll dive much more deeply into. When we think about that process, right, especially the evaluation piece we'll dive into here in a second, a lot of this is about balancing the power. What we mean by that is a lot of times how traditional nonprofit board recruitment has been is that I need people for my board. I desperately need to fill spots. Please, will you join my board, right? And then someone joins, and they join with that kind of, even if they join with good intentions, that idea that like your nonprofit really needed them, and that they're just there to help out, right? We want a lot more ownership of that, right? We want that to be much more of an equal conversation of like, they're looking to invest in the community and leverage their skills and expertise. We're providing that opportunity to really invest as a leader, and we need their expertise and skills and the perspective that they bring. So just making sure that that again, that they see it as an honor and responsibility, not just something they got selected for, and that we are excited by it. We want them to understand both those pieces. So what this looks like, we do encourage organizations to have board candidates apply. Now, in most cases, I'll say not all cases, some cases you might want to make this even harder, but in most cases, we keep these barriers to entry pretty low, right? It's kind of a bare minimum for folks to feel like there is a process. So we have candidates send in a resume and just a paragraph of interest, right? The world does not need more cover letters, in my opinion. So we don't need them to send a full formal letter or anything like that. Just one paragraph. Why do you care about our organization? Why are you excited to join the board? And a resume for the governance committee, the executive committee, some committee on the board to take a look at there. And why we ask for that paragraph, I'll say, we get asked a lot of times, what makes a successful board member? How to identify a successful board member? Obviously, someone that fits those goals you set for your recruitment, but ultimately, the most successful board members we see are folks who actually care about the thing the organization does, right? Someone who's actually passionate about education, joining an education nonprofit board, because that passion for it, that genuine interest in the work is going to make it a lot more likely that they actually follow through with the things they commit to, right? They're going to want to fundraise for the organization. They're going to want to tell people they're on the board because they're excited about it. So we want to think about how do we kind of tap into that and how do we leverage that. So candidates send a resume, paragraph of interest. It's reviewed by, most of the time the governance committee on your board is going to look at this. If you don't have a governance committee, the executive committee, and if the executive committee has too much on their plate or isn't totally engaged, some handful of 3 to 4 board members should be looking at these materials ahead of time, right? If it seems like a good fit, they're going to move to having a meeting with this person. We typically would recommend the candidate meets with at least 2 board members, and if they haven't met or know the ED, meet with the ED separately. The 2 board members can meet with them at the same time, so there's just 2 meetings there. We call it an interview on here because we're teaching about it, but with the candidate, we usually just say, like, this is a chance to kind of get to know the board a bit, right? The purpose of that conversation and that kind of interview, quote unquote, one is obviously for the board or ED organization in general to learn a bit more about that candidate, learn a bit more about their interest in the work, right? Their passion for it, as we already said, but also to kind of pressure test some of those skills, experiences, and networks that we think they're going to be able to bring to the table. The other thing we can use this conversation for isn't just to learn about them, right? And that's why it's not purely just an interview. There's also a chance to tell them about the organization, tell them about the board, hopefully get them excited, but also be honest about the expectation. If we have monthly meetings, I want them to know that ahead of time and know, like, we expect them to be there, right? If we have fundraising requirements or expectations, if we ask them to come to a certain number of events a year, if our board's a working board and they have more actual kind of, tactical responsibilities, tangible responsibilities on a regular basis, I want them to know those expectations going in, because one of the biggest things we see that causes challenges on a board culture is that the board joins the board thinking they'll do one thing, and the staff and organization need the board to do something else. And that misalignment of expectations is a real challenge. So we want this conversation to be both learning and vetting the candidate a little bit, exciting the candidate about the work, but then also being honest with the candidate about the expectations of the role, knowing that either side could self-select out, right? You might decide they're not a great fit and that we should get them involved in the organization in a different way. Or they might decide this is not the right time for me to make this commitment, right? And that would be much better than just desperately getting them to join and then them having to quit a year later, right? Or them not being engaged for their 2-year term or whatever it may be. From that conversation with the 2 board members and or ED, that governance group, the group selecting it, should come back together, discuss how those conversations went, raise any concerns, right, or excitement, and if it makes sense to move them forward, send them to the full board with a full recommendation that they get voted in. The materials, the resume and paragraph of interest should be sent to the whole board. The whole board should have a little bit of time to review that, along with the governance recommendation of why they're recommending them. And at the next board meeting or electronically, if that's how you want to vote, they should vote on the candidate and move them forward. This whole process is going to take different amounts of time. Some organizations have a set, I only accept board candidates at this meeting each year, right? So if you're on that annual or biannual cycle, it might be a pretty long time. But generally speaking, if you do accept board candidates on an ad hoc basis, we recommend kind of trying to get all this together and somewhere in that kind of 1 to 2 month time period, right? We don't want folks to feel like this is a never ending process to be able to join. So if we're able to schedule wise, this will take at least a month, right? Just with calendars these days and stuff. But if we can get it in that 1 to 2 month period, we see most candidates appreciate that and still come in kind of fired up and excited about the role. And then finally, we'll talk more about this in the next section. We're going to really focus on onboarding that person, right? So we just went through kind of the hiring process for a board member in a lot of ways. And we get this great board member who's super fired up, they understand what's expected of them, etc. Now, just like with a new staff person, we really got to think about how we're going to onboard them to the board to make sure that they stay engaged, hit the ground running, and are a positive addition to our board culture. So going into onboarding, I will say here, I might be biased, but my personal opinion is that board onboarding is actually the most important piece of board management, and often the piece that's the most overlooked or kind of haphazardly done. So if you had to invest your time one space and you don't have a ton of time to spend with your board, I would really focus on making sure the board onboarding was strong. And why that is again, if we think about hiring staff, anytime we've been hired somewhere, that first experience, right? The first week, the first 30, 60 days on the job really informs your outlook on what that organization is like, the team is like, the job is like, and it is hard to get someone who wasn't engaged initially re-engaged, right? If you were engaged and you burn out at some point, we can kind of get you back, right? There's management tips for that. But if someone comes in, isn't engaged, and that's how they kind of set their expectations, that's the story they tell themselves about the job, that's how they personally relate to the job and organization, really hard to get that staff person back. Very similar thing we see with board members. A lot of times we kind of are slow to get them engaged. And then in their head, this just becomes something that isn't that active for them, right? Or that they're not that kind of, involved with or deeply engaged with. So it's really important we think about how to do this. What this looks like, the first thing is, again, a little bit like recruitment, we need a process in place. Again, this happens ad hoc for a lot of us, and that's because we're, have just one person, right? Or the ED's doing 9 different jobs, and 100% understand that. But this is one of those things that I would personally say is going to save you a lot of time, right, in the long run. If you spend some more time onboarding now, these are going to be much more engaged and helpful board members who are going to be there in some cases for 3, 6, 9, or longer years, right? So we really want to make sure we take the time in this first year that they're on there to get things right. So on that first year on the board, there's a couple of big steps. We'll dive into a couple of these a bit more here in a second. The first thing is we really want to make sure their initial introduction to the board happens well and is celebratory, right? We want to celebrate their inclusion, make some introductions there, make them feel connected, make them feel like this is a real honor and that people are excited to have them there. Those are the two feelings I really want a new board member to have. This is an honor and responsibility, so they do need to do some stuff, and we're super pumped to have them on the team, right? Those two things together are going to guarantee me that board member is coming in with a sense of kind of excitement, right? They want to get involved because everyone's so excited to have them there, and they understand this matters, right? So they're taking it seriously. In the first 1 or 2 months, our big focus here is that they're going to get to their probably first board meeting. They're hopefully going to attend their first committee meeting. They're going to have their first kind of board buddy check-in. We'll talk more about that board buddy program in a second, but that's just going to be a board kind of peer-to-peer program. 3 to 6 months, If we haven't already done this with them, we're going to want them to fill out a commitment form. We'll talk about what that is and provide an example here in a minute, and get them involved in some type of meaningful work. You'll hear this a couple times during this onboarding section, but a lot of times we're slow to get board members involved with things because we don't want to overwhelm them, right? But by doing that, again, that board member already sets in their mind that the culture of the board is that, like, I don't really have to do much. I just show up to meetings every now and then. Committees, don't really need me or stuff like that. I'm not really needed, right? So they're there in kind of name only. So it's really important that instead we shift that so that board culture feels like, okay, this is an active responsibility that I have things to do about. And this is something I'm going to engage with, right? It's something I enjoy doing and I'm meeting other people, etc. So we want that to be their first kind of experience of the culture. 6 to 12 months, we're going to phase out that board peer-to-peer program. We're going to make sure the chair and or executive director are checking in with the board member kind of once or twice during this time. And then 1 year in, again, either the chair, if they're engaged, or if you don't have an engaged chair, the ED might have to step up and do this, asking them about how their first year has been and hinting at some future leadership roles, right? They may not be ready yet to step into something, but I want them already thinking about, especially by the end of year 2, stepping into some committee chair roles, right? Executive committee, things like that. So this is a good opportunity to have that conversation with them. The next kind of onboarding tip here is around that kind of board buddy program, the peer mentor. So this is going to be a peer mentor, peer-to-peer, board buddy, whatever you want to call it. Choosing someone that's currently on the board to help a new member get used to being on the board, right? So ideally, this is someone who isn't in a leadership position. It's just a kind of regular board member you're asking to kind of volunteer. Maybe a board member who's been there for a little bit, although it doesn't have to be the case. And they're not going to have to do too much. So you can let that current board member know this is not a huge responsibility. This is really just so that you can let that new board member know, hey, there's someone you can reach out to that isn't the chair or ED, right? To lower the stakes on that a bit. So if you have questions or things like that, you can always contact them. And the board buddy knows to check in with that new member at a couple different kind of key points, right? So they're going to check in initially to introduce themselves. They're going to check in before the first board meeting to make sure the person feels comfortable with that and kind of prepared for that. They're going to check in after the meeting, right, to see how they feel like it went. And then kind of on a monthly basis till you get to like month 6, right? So this is like 4 or 5 check-ins right across kind of 6 months. Don't have to be long conversations. Some of them could just be over email. A lot of times it's developed socially, right? So they might go out and get coffee or a drink or something. But this ensures some level of social connection for a new board member, right? So they feel like they know someone, and you kind of avoid that kind of clicks on the board, right? And the new board member is not feeling socially connected. And you have that new board member have an easy way to ask questions that, again, doesn't always feel like I have to go to the leadership to be like, hey, where can I find this, right? Or what's up with this? It's important to let that board buddy know they don't need to know all the answers, right? They may not know either the thing the person's asking, but the board buddy is there to help facilitate, right? So connect them with the leadership, ask the leadership on their behalf, or kind of interpret things kind of for them. And again, while tactical, this is really a relational role. So it's basically just kind of a welcome committee, right? A one-person welcome committee to make sure new board members, again, feel connected right away and feel involved. A board handbook. I know this is something that people may not necessarily prioritize making. There's definitely probably like a nonprofit joke in there about if you make a board handbook and no one ever opens it, did you ever make it right? Kind of like the whole tree falling in the forest thing. But it's really important we have a strong board handbook so that folks know that they can engage with the information. I'll tell you right now, a lot of new board members still aren't going to read this thing. There's a couple tips here we'll talk about to make it more likely that they do. But we want them to have it as a resource just in case, right? It also lets them know that we want them to be doing this even if they don't. So a couple of things we're going to put in there. We're not going to put the kitchen sink, right? We're going to try to be pretty specific with what we're putting in there. If we have like a one-page organizational history, we can maybe borrow this from some grants we've written before or something. That would be really helpful, right? To help them understand a little bit, here's how we've evolved over time. and a short and sweet, concise story. Especially if our organization's been around for 50 years or something, 20 years, even 10 years. There's probably a lot to include there. So giving them just the highlights can be really important. Our last strategic plan, if we have one, major financial documents like a 990 or an audit, or just kind of end of year financials from the last 2 years. And then anything else we think is kind of cool to include, right? Any other important milestone documents? Maybe we had a big anniversary in the last couple of years or something, we may want to include materials from. The main thing we're including are current materials, right? So stuff that says like, hey, here's how to get up to speed on what we're currently talking about. So you don't have to spend the next 6 or 12 months like trying to figure out what's going on. So minutes from the last 2 meetings, right? So they know what has been the conversation at board meetings. Financials from the past 2 months, right? These are the 2 things we'll have to update each time we have a new board member. Most of this can stay in there for a good period of time. The budget versus actual for the year to date, the current budget, current strat plan or annual goals, if we have either of those documents, an org chart, just so folks know kind of who's working at the organization, right, and how's it structured. If we have a 1-page program summary, again, if we don't have this, we may borrow from some of the grants we've written. That's going to be really helpful to them. And then a board roster that has contact information. So folks know who else is on the board and how to reach out to them if they have questions. And then, again, finally, we want this to be digestible, right? So adding a table of contents, maybe an executive summary at the beginning, and letting new members know they do not need to read all of this. Even the shortened version, they do not need to read everything in here. Here's a couple of things to prioritize, right? You may just tell them, like, just read the minutes from the last 2 meetings. That's it, right? You may want them to look at financials, etc. But if they understand your budget currently, org chart, and minutes, that's probably a really good starting place, right? So help them prioritize there and let them know that this is a resource for them and that you're happy to answer any questions about it. One of the final onboarding tips here around the individual commitment form. So if you don't have one of these, is one of the biggest things we recommend in terms of influencing board culture. And this is basically an annual commitment form that each board member fills out. A lot of the things are kind of boilerplate and stay the same for every board member, right? So things like, I'm going to attend meetings, I'll represent the organization well in the community, et cetera, et cetera. It might have something in there about their fundraising responsibility in terms of kind of actions they'll take. Maybe it has something in there about attending annual events or something. And if it has, if you have a certain kind of give-get level of how much board members have to raise, you can include that in here. We often get asked when we talk about this questions about what that give-get is. It varies for every organization. We typically see, we work with organizations that are in the $100,000 to $4 million budget range often, and their typical give-get we see is somewhere between $500 and $1,500 per board member, but we also have folks that are much lower or a little bit higher. I will say we actually advise folks not to have a certain number. You're often leaving some money on the table if you do that, right? Because some people can give more, some people can give less. So both for diversity and equity reasons, also for leaving money on the table, we actually encourage putting in this commitment form that everyone has to give a gift. That's one of their top 3 philanthropic gifts of the year. So if you don't want to put a certain number on it, you can instead equalize, instead of the dollars, the priority board members are giving with. So one of their top 3 philanthropic gifts has to be to your organization. And that might be $300 for someone, might be $30,000 for someone else, right? But that helps us have a wider range of folks who could potentially serve on our board while still kind of putting a level playing field there in terms of how people are investing. This agreement, again, is basically just going to outline basic expectations for board members. It shouldn't be too onerous, but just wants to set up kind of some of those typical expectations. And the biggest thing this is going to do, they're going to sign this, right? You're going to have this, and then it's going to allow for accountability. It's also going to make sure that both sides understand what expectations there are. Again, I said it before, I'll say it again, one of the biggest challenges with board cultures and how staff interact with boards is that misalignment of expectations. So making sure we have this in place so staff know what to expect from the board knows what's expected of them. And if something's happening that staff or board aren't happy about, we can quickly go back to this form and look, are the staff asking for something they haven't told the board about? Or is the board not doing something that they committed to do, right? It allows for a much more kind of straightforward accountability conversation than would happen otherwise. And finally, I want to move on to some board engagement tips, right? So we have the right people on board. We've onboarded them well. They're there and excited. What do we do with them now, right? And how do we impact a board culture if we're not actively recruiting, right? So how do I influence my current culture? A few tips. One of the biggest things we see that can impact board culture is our meetings themselves, right? And this makes a lot of sense, right? The biggest inflection points for a board are the meetings. It's a time we're getting the whole board together, which doesn't happen routinely outside of meetings. Everyone has a chance to be involved, right? Everyone has a chance to kind of take in information, also offer their opinions. So it's a really big moment for our board culture. And one or two good or bad meetings can start shifting that culture pretty quickly. So really want to think about these very intentionally. So the first part about board meetings, it really hinges on a strong agenda. So having a really strong plan for our board meeting. So what this looks like often, timing wise, is that we really think about the order and timing of what we're talking about. And most of the time it means taking some stuff out of our agenda. We often overpack it. We want there to be conversation, discussion, and a free flow of ideas, right? So what this looks like is that there's some type of consent agenda at the beginning. So consent agendas, these are just things that need a quick vote that we often spend too much time on. So approving, prior finances, approving last minute meetings, things like that, that we can send to people ahead of time, ask them to review and just quickly say, are there any questions on this? And if there's not any questions, we can pass all those type of procedural things at the beginning in one vote, get that approved and get that out of the way. We want to check in with folks at the beginning quickly and do some type of mission moment. So a mission moment here is just something to remind people why the work matters. Often this could be a story from a client. It could be a program staff testimonial. We could be going around. We want to do this every time. We could go around and ask folks in the room, why did you first join the board, right? Or what are you most excited for in the year ahead for the organization? But something to get people energized or remembering why the work matters, right? We're about ready to talk about a lot of professional things in the meeting, but I want people to stay grounded in the community impact of the work. So that quickly, in kind of the first 10 or so minutes of the meeting, there should be a finance update at every meeting, right? To make sure the board's still kind of engaged in that fiscal governance. So now we're like 20 minutes in, and then usually 1 to 2 major discussions. So big topics that we want board feedback on, right? So these could be strategic choices. It could be financial challenges, right? It could be an event that's coming up and want feedback on the ideas for it, whatever it might be. But 1 or 2 things that feel kind of strategic in nature and that we actually are looking for kind of opinions and feedback and engagement around, right? Those take somewhere between kind of 30 to 50 minutes. We wrap up doing votes we need to do on new board members or policies, et cetera, and then do an executive session where the ED or any staff that are present leave. The board meets by itself for just 5 or 10 minutes to talk about how things are going, and then things wrap up, right? So this is a pretty streamlined agenda. If you do have kind of less frequent meetings like quarterly, you might have a little more time to play with here. But this generally is going to allow all committees to be involved, everyone to kind of have an opportunity to speak, but again, focuses the board on what they care about, which is engaging with kind of strategic leadership of the organization, right? A lot of times our meetings are basically just updates from everyone quickly, no real kind of conversation or strategic engagement. And those meetings are pretty boring, right? We've all been a part of a boring board meeting, either as a member or a leader. So we want to make sure our meetings are much more engaging than that. That's going to really create, again, a culture of kind of action and a culture of engagement for the board. The second engagement tip here is around how we build ownership in these meetings, right? So we just talked about how to build that sense of action and that sense of engagement. This is going to be talking about a little bit more about the ownership piece. So how we might want to do this, if you're doing it virtual or in person, we are seeing The majority of organizations, if they haven't gone in person yet, are planning their next board meeting to be in person, I would say, over the next couple months. But some boards are going to stay virtual. And that's totally fine. Some folks are making hybrid work. I will say hybrid is the toughest option out of the three we've seen for organizations, but it definitely can work. You just have to really think about the facilitation and the tech side of that. But virtual or in person, either way. Virtual does allow for sometimes greater board participation. We've seen attendance improve with virtual meetings, right? Folks aren't rushing from work, right, or having to drive, excessively, right, to get somewhere. If you are going to do virtual, really think about how you can use breakout rooms, screen sharing, etc., to make sure people don't feel just passively involved. So that's the one challenge we do see with virtual. If we're not using breakout rooms, chat, polls, screen share, it can seem a little passive to folks. So we want to make sure that that's invested. In person, we don't see that as much of a challenge. For small groups, either in person or virtual, this is something we really see work well with boards. You know, if you're gonna have a strategic conversation, you don't have to just say like, what does everyone think about our budget? Go, right? We can instead ask some more specific questions and then break the board into smaller groups, either virtually or in person, have them discuss in those groups and then come back and share with the whole. We often get better ideas this way, more voices are heard, and it's a little bit more of a structure to the conversation, right? And then instead just relying on the group to kind of throw ideas out there. And then finally, we want to make sure as the board chair or ED that we're getting other voices involved, right? We don't need to lead every conversation or give every update. So trying to get committee chairs to own pieces of the agenda to talk about their work, getting other executive committee members, right, involved and invested, but a really great opportunity to create that ownership, right? More people will be involved in the conversation if it isn't just me running the whole thing, right? So the more voices are talking, begets kind of more voices talking, right? So it's a good opportunity there to get people engaged. Shifting gears a bit, another engagement tip, we see a lot of times the kind of board culture as we're thinking about trying to especially kind of reactivate, right? So if we have a board right now that isn't as active, isn't as engaged, and I'm trying to get them kind of re-plugged in, right, and kind of working better together. Committees are a great way to do that. And committees are great for two reasons. It gets back to that small group thing. So one, committees can really drive work. They can have pretty specific outcomes tied to them where folks have to get something done. So we can get that culture right to, again, be a little more active. The other thing committees are going to do for us, which are really helpful, is they're going to build better social connections, right? A board that feels like they know each other is more likely to show up, right? Because I'm a lot more likely to show up to something if I'm going to feel guilty that I'm letting other people down, right? So basically there's a positive peer pressure that happens here as these small groups start forming more and more. So committees can be key to both the culture and engagement and then also the culture of action. So how we can do this, right? If we don't have committees right now, or if we do in kind of name only, how we could get those restarted and kind of re-fired up. One, committee should be officially voted on by the board. So it's kind of ratified and everyone is like technically saying yes to it, right? It doesn't mean they're going to do anything about it yet, but it does mean that everyone has buy-in to them existing, at least in theory. And either of these committees are going to be long-standing, right? So I would limit how many long-standing committees you have. So standing committees are like exec, right? Finance, right? You probably have those two or should have those two. The third most likely is governance. And probably the last kind of standing committee for most smaller nonprofits or community-based organizations would be a development committee. So those 3 or 4, 2 to 4 kind of standing committees. Then beyond that, we have ad hoc committees. So these committees are usually in existence for 6 to 12 months at a time. They're often driving something specific forward, right? So they could be driving a focused fundraising effort. They could be driving an event. They could be driving a strategic planning process. They could be driving or looking into, for instance, program expansion. So some type of ad hoc committee that's a little more focused on something kind of short-term and tangible. When we vote on that committee, we should have the board look at a board charter for them. So this is a one-page quick outline of the committee and their role. This is going to focus on, for instance, how long it should be active, right? Is it standing or ad hoc? If it's ad hoc, how long do we expect it to be in existence for? What's its main focus, right? What's the why behind having this committee? What are the responsibilities and power we're giving to this committee? What outcomes do we want to see from it? And if there's anything about the committee structure we want to highlight, right? So how large the committee is, how many members we want to be on it, et cetera, can be helpful. We don't have to put meeting frequency in there or stuff, but if we want to get agreement on that to kind of drive accountability for it, we can. Then finally, this initial process, right, of having the charter, having the vote, and having people kind of join it, hopefully is going to get better investment from them, right? They know what they're joining. The expectations are clear. The work is laid out for them. So we really can use this to drive that hopefully initial buy-in and initial engagement for the committee. Once committees are up and running, right? So we voted, we have a charter, we have people who have joined the committee. How do we kind of drive the work forward, right? No guarantee here. And I will say one thing that's not on here that's super important is having a great committee chair. If we can get a really good committee chair, someone who's going to really drive the work, right? Email people, follow up with members. That's probably the biggest key to success. That is sometimes easier said than done, depending on the current kind of culture of engagement on our board, but something we see is really important. A couple of tips outside of having that strong chair that you're partnering with. One thing is just defining kind of what you need from them and when. Right, so letting that committee know, hey, we're going to have an event in May, right? They can work backwards from that, and they're going to have something there, right? They don't want to show up at board meetings. Another reason why you give part of the agenda to your committees, they don't want to show up to monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly board meetings and routinely say, oh, we actually haven't done anything, right? So this is why we want committees to give updates during meetings, but giving them that deliverable, being really specific with that is key. Having them work backwards then is going to tell you how often they need to be meeting. Most committees meet monthly. They could be meeting bi-monthly or bi-weekly though, depending on the workload, if it's higher or lower. And we can use that to set some expectations. And then finally, for standing committees, it is important that at least every 2 years, we kind of recommit to those and have the board kind of reapprove them. So just something to keep a note, for exec, for finance, things like that, it can become kind of rote pretty quickly for an organization. We always have had this committee. So it's important at least every 2 years, even if we're changing nothing about it, we're re-voting to keep doing it because it's going to give people a chance to kind of wake up a little bit and think about, oh, this stuff needs to get done, right? Or like, are we doing this? Does this make sense? Is there other stuff we need to do? Two things we want to avoid here. In most cases, the committee should be doing additional kind of capacity building work for the organization, not replacing staff work. Now, if you have a working board, if you're a volunteer-led organization, right, this line gets a little more blurry. The committee may be doing more kind of day-to-day stuff. We still want to typically try to keep the committees out of day-to-day operations, simply for the sustainability of it, right? We may have a board member or two assigned to doing some of those more staff-like operations, but not having a committee per se assigned to it. And then finally, we want deadlines, right? If we just tell a committee, standing or ad hoc, hey, like, do this when you get a chance, it's not going to get done. So we really want to make sure we're being very clear about the expectations there. And the final piece I'll say before we pause for questions from folks is around board evaluation. So this is something that we see about a third to kind of 40% of nonprofits do. But we really recommend it, and probably beyond the kind of onboarding piece I already mentioned, one of the more important things you could do for your board culture that we don't see people doing right now. And when we think about a board evaluation, what this looks like, it's an annual process. We often recommend it happens roughly around the same time the board evaluates the executive director. Also, we recommend the board evaluates the executive director annually. But if that's happening, doing it roughly at the same time, it just sets a nice image that both sides of the leadership for the organization are being evaluated and held accountable, right? It's not just all on staff. And for a board evaluation, there's 2 layers of the evaluation. So you're asking board members usually to fill out a quick survey, and they're going to fill out that survey about how they think the board as a whole is performing, right? We're usually going to have some questions on there about the board culture, right? Do you feel it's inclusive? Do you feel like your opinions are respected, et cetera? You're going to have some questions on there about board performance. Do you think people are doing what they said they do? Do you think we're fulfilling our financial obligation? Do you think we're attending meetings attentively, et cetera? I might have some questions about leadership, right? Do you feel like our board chair has been effective? How are meetings going for you, et cetera? So there's that level where board members are answering a quick survey about how they feel the board overall is doing. But they're also going to answer a survey about how they feel they themselves are doing. This can be anonymous, right? But ask them, do you feel like you're living up to what you wanted to? Are you getting what you wanted out of this board? Are you fulfilling the expectations that were set for you, et cetera? We then are going to look at those results, both on an individual basis and the kind of collective responses to know how the board is performing, right? And then hopefully to, as the first thing here says, set some goals, right? Then we want the board to set goals for itself about the collective performance of the board. At least one of those should probably be about outputs of the board, right? What we're doing can be about fundraising, meeting attendance, prospect acquisition, whatever. And one of those should probably be about the board culture in most cases. So setting at least 2 goals, one about, we want to be more inclusive, we want to have more conversation, we want to be more engaged and active, et cetera. And one goal about we want to recruit better, fundraise better, attend meetings better, know our finances better, et cetera. In addition to the goals, right, we do the evaluation piece, and we hopefully are driving some self-accountability during this process and some board accountability. And the board having to really kind of look at itself at least once a year. And then during those executive sessions we talked about at board meetings, the board can check in on these goals and make sure things are positively happening, right? This does kind of require having at least one kind of board champion for this. You can't do this easily if it's just the ED. So I will say, if you currently don't really have anyone on your board who's very engaged, you may want to focus on getting that one champion, right? That new board member kind of fired up or something, and then leveraging them to help get this process started as they maybe move into a leadership role. So with that, I'll just go over a couple quick next steps, then pause for questions. There's a lot of things we could do to impact our board culture that we talked about today, just a couple kind of quick things. Always good to check in with our board members. A lot of times we don't necessarily take the time, right, to just see how folks are doing. There might be a lot of reasons these days, right, for why someone's not engaged. So one part of the board culture we want is that kind of sense of connection. So hopefully divvying this up with maybe the chair and vice chair and the ED. If not, the ED may have to do all these, but just kind of checking in on people, giving them a call, email, seeing how things are going at least once or twice a year in between meetings. Prioritizing a couple things for the next board agenda, right? So we don't talk about everything, but we have a couple kind of strategic conversations as we discussed. Deciding if our board meeting is going to be virtual or in person. Again, we see them be effective either way, but we need to make that choice ahead of time and then really build an agenda for the platform that we're choosing. Make sure our committees have tasks to do so people feel engaged and like they have real work to do on the board. Engage in the board in some of the strategic conversations, right? Get them excited to be there and understand that important things are happening. So they need to step up and be engaged. And then finally, never a bad time to thank our board members. During all this, right, it's important to remember, even as we put all the structure and time and work in, and it is a responsibility they're committing to, but ultimately our board members are volunteers, right? Volunteers and donors. So it's really important that engagement and stewardship piece is still something we're doing with them, because that often gets lost as we're thinking about kind of the professional side of it. So with that, I'll pause for any questions we got.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Some really fascinating content there and a great overview. So we appreciate you sharing that. We do have some questions that have come in, and fair warning, some of these are maybe a little more challenging than others, but I'll start with an easy one, which is someone asking, would it be possible to have a copy of the board commitment template?
Sure. Yeah, we have a template. I'm happy to send that to you, and you all can send it out. That's great.
Okay. Yep, after today's training, if you want to send it my way, I'll make sure that our
Yep,
attendees receive that.
happy to.
Next up, this individual, and this is coming from an organization that's not a C3. I believe they're a C4, so kind of with some interesting dynamics there. But I work with a volunteer nonprofit, and we have a mix of board members and staff who are compensated equally. And sometimes I struggle to determine if I should promote existing staff members or go look for outsiders to bring new ideas, contacts, and perspectives. At times, I feel like I should reward long-term staff for their efforts with a seat at the table. Any thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing there, anytime we're kind of recruiting for any type of board, right, paid, unpaid, etc., we're thinking about kind of why we're doing the recruitment, what perspective are we trying to bring, right? Who's not at the table currently? What expertise are we maybe light on? So I would use that to really kind of guide that decision-making process. That if I feel like I have folks internally that can do it, that can grow into it, that's great. But if I feel like that identity, perspective, expertise isn't there right now, I prioritize kind of filling those gaps because we want to make sure we have a well-rounded kind of table, right, to give us feedback.
Yeah. And if there are follow-up questions to these, feel free to send those in the Q&A or the chat, please. A couple more questions that have come in. Our culture has historically been one of a working board where they volunteer a lot and roll up their sleeves. That's been great and probably what we needed. But I believe now we should start shifting to a strategic board. What thoughts do you have about overcoming the historic mindset that exists with most of our current board members? They seem to want to focus mainly on recruiting those who are best suited for volunteer tasks.
So this is a really common challenge we hear, and probably the biggest challenge we see. This, and then also when you're switching to that friends, family board that knows each other really well, to maybe getting some outsiders, right, quote unquote, on there. So both those really require a couple of things. One, for switching from that working to governance, really updating, for instance, the commitment form that you have for the organization, the job description for board members, right, that you're using in your recruitment efforts, because that can start shifting who we're thinking about. And then really encouraging the current board to think about what we're lacking in terms of perspective, expertise, skill, right? A lot of times that's going to lean more towards folks that can come in with that consulting background, finance background, legal expertise that are going to be looking for a governance opportunity. And then as we recruit, right, telling folks that are new that this, setting the expectation that this is governance not working. And for, those volunteer board members that really still want to roll up their sleeves, finding some slightly more governance type activities for them to do, right? So moving them from maybe being involved in the programming and rolling up their sleeves to being involved in kind of some fundraising efforts, right? Which could include like researching prospects. So it doesn't actually have to be go out there getting money, but they could be helping with some financial capacity building on the fundraising side, which at least moves them closer to getting there. So it's definitely a process. Boards exist on a spectrum. No one's ever one or the other entirely, but starting to kind of set those expectations with new board members and memorialize it in some documents like commitment form, job description, and then start setting some of those committee works to be slightly more governance focused, even though they're still going to be kind of doing something pretty tangible.
Okay. And it's interesting across those last two questions, one common thread there is, to step back and kind of do that skill gap analysis. And I'm wondering, do you have any resources, a template or anything that might help guide our attendees on that kind of analysis of what gaps exist and what skills the board could use?
Yeah, I'm happy to also send along to y'all a template for a board skills matrix. So it's simply kind of looking at who currently is on your board, right? Kind of what are they bringing to the table, and then where the gaps are as a result.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question says, we have 2 toxic board members that are influencing our culture overall. I think asking them to leave is a last resort due to a number of different factors. I'd like your thoughts. I have directly talked to them in the past, but it did not seem to help very much.
Definitely, yeah. And this is another thing that we see, especially as that shift on the board happens, that we end up with some folks who might be toxic to the culture. So a couple of things we can do there. One, using those commitment forms and having kind of expectations set on the board, right? As we bring on new people and as the other members start doing stuff, if those two members, right, start seeing that they're the only two not doing something or the only two responding in a certain way, that often they'll start self-selecting out, right? Folks don't want to be part of something that they feel like they're not good at. Folks don't want to be part of something that they feel like they're kind of an outsider in. So setting those board agendas really tightly, right? Thinking ahead of time about where does that toxicity kind of most show up? Is it in the board conversations? Is it in email threads? And how can I manage against that? So if it's often when we have open conversation that they say some derailing things during meetings, can I plan a little bit more heavily facilitated conversation there to avoid that a little bit, right? Or can I have one of the other board members lead that part? Because a lot of times we see those board members are toxic with the ED and chair, but won't necessarily respond as aggressively to someone else on the board. So that's another good opportunity there. And then again, as we set those expectations moving forward and bring on new folks, a lot of times we see those more kind of classical members that have been there that aren't kind of getting with the program start self-selecting out. And that's often kind of the ideal scenario. We're not really going to usually re-engage those folks, but if we're able to get them to choose to leave, we can sometimes even keep them as a donor. We can look to kind of transition to the advisory board. And the other side of this too, I'll just say, is term limits. The sooner you can put those in place, the better. If you don't have those on your board right now, trying to get the board to approve those. And if the board doesn't want to, informing them a lot of times that term limits are just a best practice. A lot of foundations look to see boards have those, and using that kind of argument that we want to look strong to institutional funders as a reason to put them in place can be helpful if the conversation is a little stagnant on adding term limits.
Mm-hmm. Good. And good questions so far. Thank you all for sending those in. The last one that we received says, what recruitment trends are you seeing among smaller nonprofits? We're struggling to recruit volunteers and board members, even more so in the last 2 years.
Definitely. I'll say for volunteers, we see actually interest is higher than usual. Although there has been a bigger drop off of people signing up than not showing up in person. I think people are excited to get back and do things in the community, but then realize like, oh, I have to like go outside my house, right? Or like this isn't on Zoom. So that's led a few more drop-offs there on the volunteer front. But on board specifically, we are seeing people look to invest. We actually have seen interest in general be higher for what small nonprofits are doing. I think that's going well. One is leveraging existing networks more. So going to the local chamber of commerce, right? Going to the regional association of accountants, right, or whatever it might be, and asking if you can put a board opportunity out there to their network. A lot of those places don't have a lot of events right now to engage their members. So we're looking for things to highlight in the community. So that's a great way that if you specifically have a certain kind of person in mind you're looking for, you can use those existing networks to tap into. LinkedIn for board member recruitment has actually been better than expected. And you can definitely put it on Indeed, Idealist, etc. But LinkedIn is actually a great one if you're trying to get people who you don't know currently to bring them in. And then finally, if you're doing traditional recruitment, we're asking your board, who else might be a good board member. The biggest thing we see there is being more specific. So if I just tell my board members, hey, who do you think might be a good board member? Who do you think might be a good donor, etc.? That's a lot of people to think through, right? They have to think through everyone they know, coworkers, past coworkers, neighbors, friends, etc. If instead I'm like, hey, we're looking for a board member, here's the skills, here's the expertise, we hope they kind of live in this area, we hope they kind of do this thing or like this stuff, then some specific names might come to mind. So really priming our board members to think of specific people instead of just like, who do you know that might want to do it?
Mm-hmm. So again, do that gap analysis to identify the skills you need. And you could even weave this into an engagement exercise. I mean, use some of the board member or board meeting time to have a small group discussion where you break up the board. They can brainstorm who they think would be great volunteers or board members around these certain skills that you need. And, there you go. So there are a number of different strategies to do that. But, it's been a theme here locally that it's been particularly difficult, especially on the volunteer side. So it's interesting to hear, your observations, Matt, that maybe folks around here aren't coming back in such a way yet. So good. Well, thank you so much, Matt. We really appreciate it. We appreciate everyone who attended today. Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think that's it. I'll follow up those materials though.
Okay, perfect. As you mentioned earlier, we're going to send a follow-up evaluation. We do want to hear your feedback about today's session and certainly any ideas you have for future trainings that we should be offering. We'll include the slides and the materials that Matt has offered and also today's recording. There's a lot coming up for DCMP members. We encourage you to visit dcmp.org and follow us on Facebook for upcoming training and opportunities. For example, we have our registration open now for our next webinar, which is our fall 2022 HR update, and that's featuring Paul Lalonde from CETA of Cook County, and he really knows human resources. So we hope you'll join us for that. It's hosted on September 7th at 11 a.m. And Nonprofit Day is right around the corner as well. That's our annual conference on September 22nd. You can view the conference agenda and register today by visiting our website. Finally, the Community Foundation is accepting applications for multiple grant programs at the moment, and those deadlines are approaching fast, so you can learn more and apply by visiting DeKalbCCF.org. Once again, I want to thank you all for attending, and another thank you goes to Matt Gayer for sharing his time and expertise with all of us today. Thanks a lot and take care.